hope everyone has got a copy of. If not, there are some spares that I'll just leave here. They're, I've thrown the paper away. Some spares. Like Jonathan Bates, I have a task for you from the very beginning. That is to look at the first sentence on the handout in the box, which is the kind of English sentence which fascinates many linguists, especially those working in Chomsky-inspired linguistics departments worldwide. The question I'd like to answer while I'm working my way through this talk is this. Is this an English sentence? Would anybody say it? And the sentence is, the men from Glasgow went, for men to go would have been impossible. Keep thinking about that as we proceed, as asking the question will help focus our thoughts on what kind of English language work fits most comfortably within an English department, which is the kind of question I'd like to pursue this morning. I've been invited here this morning to speak with a particular brief concerning English language studies. There are a number of problems with this. Modern English language is studied in departments of linguistics, and it has a very particular orientation in such departments. Few colleagues here today have much experience of the formal study of modern English language. Most English degrees are degrees in English literature, cultural studies, or have a main focus on literature and the history of the language in relation to literature. The national and international picture is changing before our eyes, however. English language A-level is now officially the fastest growing A-level subject. That's English language A-level and the new English language and literature A-level. At postgraduate levels, the figures are startling, with MA and PhD degrees in modern English language and applied linguistics in almost all our universities outstripping almost every other subject area, with the exception of business studies, law, and medicine. Many of the students are international students, or they are students who teach English internationally. The study of the English language is growing exponentially. Just put these figures up for you to have a look at. As measured in 2001, and you can guess there are all sorts of theoretical complexities in measuring this, but as measured by David Crystal in 2001, there are 400 million native speakers of English worldwide, 400 million speakers of English as a second or institutionalized second language. That's countries like Singapore and India, to a large degree Nigeria and so on. And over 1 billion speakers of English as a foreign language. We know there's more Chinese spoken on a day-to-day basis, but the demographic spread is different. So I think it's fair enough to say that English is the world language. In fact, since 2001, the figures have changed somewhat. And there are now more non-native second language speakers of English than there are native speakers of English, which raises, for me, profound questions about the ownership of the English language and the place of native speakers within that formation. And I'll return to that topic under my subheading is whose English is English. It is, however, just worth noting that the subject of English language is very differently accented at A-level in the school curriculum and in undergraduate and postgraduate contexts, and that these accents are even more sharply pronounced in the context of the study of English as a national and international subject. And I teach English language in an English department and have little difficulty relating to the way in which the subject is taught at A-level, and deal with vast numbers of students at postgraduate levels, but always feel complications in situating what I do within the current Nottingham English degree. There are various ways in which modern English language can be situated in an English degree, but within an undergraduate context, a student population that is still largely concerned with literary studies, it's difficult to find an appropriate cross-fertilization between these areas. And it's one of these things that I'd like to talk about this morning, with particular reference to a field called Corpus Linguistics, an area which is at the moment revolutionizing, in my view, the study of the English language. Corpus Linguistics is not the study of dead bodies, but it's a new field in which computer-stored multi-million word data files are used to access information about the English language, and to access that information in ways which individuals working on their own or in groups couldn't possibly access, because we just don't have the brain power and storage to work with the language in that depth and to that degree of multitude. The UK is very much the world leader in this work, with substantial investment made by major publishers such as Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, in new grammars and dictionaries based on the findings of Corpus Linguistics. Using recorded and attested examples of usage, often backed up by computational analysis, which gives us, for example, facts about the most frequent words within the language, or the most frequent grammatical patterns, or the most frequent usages. And most significantly, and this is what I want to talk about mainly this morning, there are now collections of naturally occurring, everyday, spoken English available for study and research, allowing access to millions of words and word patterns of common speech on our computer screens. For the first time, grammars and dictionaries of English are reflecting how we speak the language as well as how we write it. Some departments of English, where there is a staffing critical mass in English language study, and where there is a balance of work across language and literature, such as Nottingham, where I work, or Birmingham, Sheffield, Newcastle, UCE, Huddersfield, Leeds, or Liverpool, to indicate just a few, have tried to inflect these developments in their modern English language work. I'll just show you, if I may, what a corpus looks like on your computer screen when you throw up a particular word. In this case, colleague and I were very interested in the way in which the passive voice is different in spoken English compared with written English. In written English, the standard construction for the passive voice is a verb to be plus a past participle, as you know, was accepted, that kind of structure. When we searched for this within our spoken corpus, we found there just weren't that many examples. But the pattern we did find to be prominent was this one, called the get passive. Now, the get passive is not recorded in the 1,842-word contemporary grammar of the English language constructed by Randolph Quirk here in the University of London in the 1980s, which is still the standard grammar for teaching English internationally. It's not recorded. It is recorded. It's recorded a little footnote on page 1,200 or so. The reason it's not recorded is that that grammar is based largely on written examples, not spoken examples. It's based on examples of single sentences. This pattern, if you want a Jonathan Bate type fact, is 8.4% more frequent in spoken English, 8.4 times more frequent in spoken English than in written English. What a computer can do is give you access to multi-million word usages, and it can sort alphabetically for you around a key word, which is done here with the word got. It can do more than that. It can do more than isolate a single word. It can help see a particular pattern. And if you look to the right of the keyword got, to the kinds of verbs that come into semantic partnership with it, we've noticed things that we didn't know before, and which I think, had we just been working as intuitive linguists, we wouldn't have noticed in any significant pattern. He got badly burned, got broken into, got brought up, got burgled, got caned, got called an idiot, got deported, got done for drugs, got dyed grey in the wash, got picked up, got jilted, got curb crawled, got led up the garden path, got offered a job, but it was a job he didn't want, got raided by the police, got ripped off, got robbed, got slapped in the face, got stolen, got sued, got told about it that it was something you didn't want to hear. What this particular verb seems to attract is a set of semantics which are adversative. It encodes as a verb things that happen to you that you don't want to have happen to you. The contexts are largely negative. And when you move with your mouse to any one of these single lines and just one click, the context in which this data has been collected appears in your screen. You get an extended version of the text. And you see that in 9 out of 10 cases, the structure appears in a spoken narrative of one kind or another, in which you are telling someone things about yourself. Positioning yourself always in some kind of adversative context, which is just in itself an interesting cultural feature of the way we tell stories. We don't tell stories about ourselves which put ourselves in favourable light. They're always in an unfavourable light in some way. Interesting, too, is that very understanding shows us that grammar and lexis can't be easily divided as systems within the language. For the last 100 years or so, linguists have tended to segment the language and look at it very atomistically. So grammar has been seen as one level of language organisation, lexis as another level of language organisation. Corpus study of this kind is beginning to change our perceptions and see that a grammatical structure entails a particular semantic structure, that the choice of the get passive within ordinary everyday speech entails a particular semantic prosody, and therefore vocabulary and grammar cannot be so easily divorced. That's one type of study that might be undertaken within the context of modern English language studies, and many courses do within the frame of Corpus Linguistics look at language analytically in that kind of way, seeking for evidence from different types of corpora, and this is after all only drawn from one corpus. If you take other corpora, some of them for example which are more formal, there are lots of corpora for example available drawn from the BBC World Service which are very easily obtainable, and where the English is always several notches higher in terms of formality, the get passive hardly appears. So you have to always interrogate the basis of your corpus before making any kinds of judgments about distribution of forms. But it is still a rather formalistic study, as you can see. It does have tendencies towards the atomism that I was criticising earlier. So I'd like to move on, while respecting that as a perfectly valid and legitimate academic process of research and study, and one that contributes a lot to the teaching of English as a second or foreign language. I would like to suggest that that approach is not necessarily always the right one within the context of an English undergraduate degree, any more than it is to study whether the men from Glasgow actually got there or whether it was better for the men to have gone. I want to talk this morning about two structures of language, two pretty fundamental structures of language. Pattern forming and pattern reforming structures. Pattern reforming structures are all around us. Jonathan Bay had his taxi story, and this is my airport story, because I encountered a clutch of them very recently while checking in for a flight to Birmingham Airport. As I was making my way towards the airport check-in, my eye was caught by a single line of red and blue letters spread out against a large glass-fronted placard. The letters were the letters of the alphabet. I looked more closely, at first noticing that one of the letters was missing, that its absence was accentuated by a gap between the letter P and the letter R. That's the first item on the handout. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Closer inspection revealed that it was, in fact, an advertisement for an airline which counted among the proclaimed benefits of travelling business class that there were to be no queues at its check-in desk. Wasn't true, in fact. You were better off in economy on that day, but then the advertisement was British Airways. On my way to the departures lounge, I went to buy a newspaper and noticed that the headline in the Sun that day was "To Love, Honour and OK." A reference to the Michael Douglas, Catherine Zeta-Jones marriage, where they brought in OK magazine to pay $1 million for their photographs, and he was describing that. Just the previous day, it's very serendipitous all of this, I'd been driving through Melton Mowbray, as you do, and saw an advertisement for a camping shop with someone had written in large cursive handwriting, "Now is the discount of our winter tent." These are all examples of what I want to call pattern reforming. They're very, very significant in the corporate that we've been looking at. We do this a lot daily, not just in public formations, public cultural context, but as part of daily conversational exchanges. And they're very important. Pattern reforming. A pattern is taken and then broken or deviated from in some way. Or in the case of the camping shop placard and the Sun headline, a pattern is established by common or shared cultural knowledge and is then played with or played against. These are not particularly original observations. The Russian formalists and the Czech formalists and others have been telling us this since the 1920s and the 1930s, using terms like foregrounding and deviation and estrangement and so on. And indeed, Roman Jakobson, in that famous conference devoted to linguistics and poetics in 1960, also illustrated how these same kinds of patterns occur not only in poetry, but in political slogans and everyday language use. However, we know less about the other major structure, which I think is even more significant in a corpus of spoken English, and that's pattern forming. Back to the airport, and several minutes later, and sitting in the departures lounge, my thoughts were interrupted by the person next to me, a young Irishman who was holding a child, a little girl about 18 months of age, in his arms, and who was moving the child rhythmically back and forth while gazing intently into the child's eyes, and occasionally rubbing his nose against hers. He was singing nursery rhymes which I had long forgot having sung to my own children, but then, interestingly, surprisingly, recalled with remarkable immediacy. One of them was, "Diddle, diddle, dumpling, my son John went to bed with his trousers on, one shoe off and one shoe on, diddle, diddle, dumpling, my son John." All signifiers, no clear signifying. And this example, insofar as this example is different, in that the semantic content is less transparent compared with the pattern reforming examples. What are the meanings of diddle and dumpling? They have established dictionary definitions, but their normal referential meanings seem to be suspended, particularly since the remainder of the text asks us to forego any formal logical understanding of why John might go to bed dressed in trousers while alternately dispensing with single shoes and socks. You could interrogate Hickory Dickory Dock in the same way and get nowhere. The communicative purpose of a nursery rhyme is, of course, not so straightforward. The context of the young Irish father singing when in close physical proximity to his daughter is crucial. The content of the message matters less than its communicability. It is performed rather than read. The sounds and movement of the rhyme, especially its repetitions, powerfully override any referential meaning. The nursery rhyme is representational before it is referential, its primary purpose being to represent, and by representing to help to create a relationship, reinforced by the very physical act of rubbing noses while singing. The patterns of sound, lexis and grammatical structure are familiar, and they are repeated, reinforcing rather than reforming a way of seeing and a way of doing. The example exemplifies the feature of pattern forming, where one pattern is reproduced on the basis of a previous pattern. Using our multi-million word databases and the latest software, Corpus Linguistics has demonstrated that such patterns are very frequent in ordinary, everyday conversational contexts, with pattern forming being especially secret. Let's now move on to some more obviously spoken texts. If you look at the handout, I think it's item 4, where two students are talking about the landlord of a mutual friend. The first student says, yeah, he must have a bob or two. Whatever he does, he makes money out of it just like that. Bob's your uncle. He's quite a lot of money tied up in property and things. He's got a finger in all kinds of pies and houses and stuff. A couple in Bristol, one in Cleveland, I think. Incidentally, thing is the most frequent noun in our corpus, and stuff is the second most frequent. The example contains both pattern forming and pattern reforming. The exchange deviates from familiar existing patterns. Take, for example, the ways in which idioms are used. Idioms are regularly fixed in their form. For example, you can take a short sleep by having 40 winks. But you can't say, I'm just nipping home for 50 winks or 39 winks. They're rigidly fixed in forms, or at least that's what conventional lexicons tell us. But in this exchange, the idiomatic patterns are reformed and extended so that the established idiom to have a finger in every pie is creatively transmuted into he's got a finger in all kinds of pies and houses and stuff. Look at example 5 as well, where there are two social workers talking. I don't know, but she seems to have picked up all kinds of lame ducks and trammers along the way. That's her vocation. Perhaps it is. She should have been a counsellor. Yeah, but the trouble with her is she puts all her socialist cards before the law. So there is pattern reforming with the creative displacement of idiom. But there is also pattern forming, in particular in terms of the word Bob, where one speaker appears to choose or to repeat or to at least echo the pattern in order to concur with the previous speaker. There's a clear ideational content to the exchange, for the speakers are talking about the relative wealth of the local landlord. But as in the example of the nursery rhymes, the speakers also work to create a convergent relationship, in particular by negotiating and reinforcing a mutuality of viewpoint, a common way of seeing things in common language. Indeed, across the whole conversational extract, short though it is, there is not only a pervasively creative wordplay, but the play with word patterns is doing more than merely display. It is introducing a more affective element into the discourse by creating shared attitudes and by reinforcing relationships. There is no clear semantic parallel between the coin, Bob, you must have a bob or two, and a name within an idiomatic formation, Bob's your uncle. And so the parallel is either established accidentally or by means of an altogether more subliminal configuration across the speaking terms. This is not exceptional. It happens very, very regularly in everyday conversation. The two speakers are working creatively here, in my view, to establish mutuality, just like the Irish father and his daughter. And repetition and echoing, what I'm calling pattern forming, are central to the discourse strategies. Deborah Tannen, in a wonderful book called Talking Voices, which I would strongly, strongly recommend if you're interested in this kind of broadly socio-cultural, socio-linguistics, says that repetition is a resource by which conversationalists together create a discourse, a relationship, and a world. It is the central linguistic meaning-making strategy, a limitless resource for individual creativity and interpersonal involvement. Corpus study, I repeat, confirms that these features are not isolated phenomena, but are ubiquitous in everyday language use and in common demotic spoken language in particular. There's a long piece of text that I'd now like us to look at, which is number 6 on the handout. It's a bit risky reading it through. It's a bit risky reading it, actually, because I'm going to have to do 4 or 5 female voices. However, the risks and misrepresentations may, I hope, be worth it. These are 3 female art college students just chatting to each other over tea on a Sunday afternoon, part of our Cancode corpus, and I'll say a little bit more about the corpus in due course. Oh, those cherry bakewells look lovely. They do, don't they? Oh, they were gorgeous. Did you say you'd like a cup of tea? Yeah. All right then. Sound like a right mother, don't I? You do. But they'd go smashing with a cup of tea, wouldn't they? They would. Cup of tea and a fag. Cup of tea and a fag, Mrs. We're going to have to move the table, I think. Yeah. Do you like Sarah's table? She's constructed of boots and a book. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's really good there. Look. I'll just put the Milky Way wrapper as that little extra support. I like Sunday nights for some reason, I don't know why. Do not expect in ordinary, everyday conversational exchanges for there to be logical sequences of discourse. There's what linguists call topic drift. And the more intimate you are with someone, in every sense of the word intimate, in your exchanges, the more likely there is to be topic drift. You make of that what you will, but it's a fact. A contestable fact, but a fact. I like Sunday nights for some reason, I don't know why, because you come home, I come home, you come home, and you can see what I'm up to, can't you? I've underlined the pattern forming that takes place. Go out, yeah. Sunday's a really nice day, I think. It certainly is. It's a really nice, relaxing day. It's an earring. It's an earring. Oh, lovely. It's fallen apart a bit, but it's quite a nice one actually. I like that. I bet. Is that supposed to be straight? Yeah. Oh, I think it looks better like that. And there was another bit as well, another dangling. What, attached to the top bit? That one? Yeah. So it was even mobile earring. Well, that looks better like that. It looks better like that. Oh, what did I see? Stained glass. I went to a craft fair in Cambridge, and I went to a craft fair in Cambridge, and they had this stained glass store. It was all mobile, made out of stained glass. Wow. And they were superb, they were. And the mirrors with all different colours, like going around in the colour wheel with all different sized bits of coloured glass on it. Nice. It was superb. Massive. I should say none of this data ever enters contemporary English grammar. English grammars, for illustrative purposes, rely exclusively on single sentences, often made up by the grammarian in order to illustrate a particular point. It skews radically our view of language. In my view, it skews it dangerously, and we need to find ways of admitting common speech into our dictionaries and grammar. But that's almost a topic for another conference, perhaps more a linguistics conference than a literary linguistics conference. The pattern forming here, and maybe I don't really need to say much more about it because you can see it for yourselves, it involves both verbatim, phrasal and clausal repetitions. So whole stretches and chunks of language are getting repeated across these speaking terms. The patterning with variation includes repetition of words like bit or like in their different grammatical realizations as verb and preposition, as well as repetition of the determiner that. There's pronominal variation, there's phonological variation, repetition is by means of word, phrase, clause, and phonetic pattern. I've highlighted the patterns on the handout because pattern-forming choices do not normally draw attention to themselves. And while we're doing them in everyday conversation, we don't actually notice that we're doing it. Or at least we don't notice it until someone breaks the pattern. The most pattern-reforming choices, on the other hand, do attract attention to themselves. The most marked example of pattern reforming in example 6 involves the word mobile, as I think you've noticed, which is metaphorically linked with the word earrings. The earrings are big dangly earrings, and they're seen as mobile because they're moving about, but also because they look like the kind of mobile that hangs over a baby's cot. Were this bit of data not collected in 1994, and I want to make this point extra powerfully, I say it was recorded last year. There's also the hint of a mobile phone, but that's not the case. It was in 1994, and I don't think mobiles were sufficiently part of the texture of the language at that point. But nonetheless, there's a play on the word mobile, a pun on the word mobile, a play on the word mobile. The pattern forming provides a kind of affective platform reinforced by familiar allusions to Milky Way bars and cherry bakewells, which generate the wordplay which in turn provides a stimulus to the narrative recount of personal experience. Sometimes the effect of these mainly pattern-reforming features is playfully to provide for humour and entertainment, but all such patterns also generate innovative ways of seeing things and convey the speaker's own more personalised representation of events. It is too much to claim this to be a poetry talk. But ordinary, everyday, common exchanges like this can't be dismissed as non-poetic either. I'll have to leave you to look at some of the other examples, but do look at the conversation between the two lifeguards at a swimming pool in Southampton. And it would be indelicate on me to read it at this time in the morning, do look at the discussion between friends engaged in do-it-yourself activities. I'm afraid DIY, whenever you key that into our search engines, immediately throws up a whole array of sexual puns and verbal play, and people cannot talk about DIY for very long without descending into a rich carnivalesque language. The corpus I've worked on, I and colleagues at Nottingham University, is called the CAN-Code corpus. CAN-Code stands for Cambridge and Nottingham Corpus of Discourse in English. It's a corpus of 5 billion words of everyday spoken English, which has taken us nearly 10 years to collect. It may sound a long time, but if you've ever transcribed spoken English and understood something of the complexities involved, the misrepresentations involved in transcription, and then computerized it, and then tried to develop software which enables you to read some of these patterns, including the kinds of patterns that I've illustrated for grammatical purposes. It's a very, very time-consuming project. We also use the British National Corpus, which contains 10 million words of spoken English alongside 90 million words of written English. Our own corpus, we hope, is sufficiently sociolinguistically profiled. That's matched for region of the country, age of speaker, gender of speaker, social class of speaker, to ensure that we are capturing a richer demographic profile than Radio 4 or BBC World Service. Why are we only beginning to notice and describe such things? As I've already hinted, such explorations of spoken English have been limited by the research paradigms of linguistics in the 20th century. Chief among these is the modelling of descriptive frameworks on the basis of written rather than spoken examples, as well as a preoccupation with invented sentences rather than naturally occurring discourse, with discourse which privileges the referential and the ideational over the representational, the affective, and the interpersonal. The high prestige, according to written text, is seen in the slippages between words such as literacy, letters, literature, literate, and so on. And we shouldn't forget that we've been looking largely at figures of speech, such as metaphor, idioms, hyperbole, understatement, but that in most studies these features are not examined in speech, although they are figures of speech. There may be several reasons for this state of affairs. The fact that written language is much easier to obtain and to study, that almost all good models of usage involve writing, often literary writing. There is no Oxford book of good conversation, there's no Palgrave's golden treasury of spoken interaction, and so no history of successful models on which to build judgments. We have the speeches of Winston Churchill, of course, but it is formal oratory and debating that are recognised. There are no paradigms for successful achievements, and I would argue those girls are just achieving a lot interpersonally and very successfully in everyday discourse. In some cultures, of course, especially Eastern cultures, oral discourse is privileged, with construction by a group, usually working from memories and rehearsals, valued over the work of an individual. On a practical level, too, we've been constrained by our technologies. It's only in the past 20 years or so, some would say even the past 5 years, that our recording and microphone technologies have developed to the point where recordings of sufficient quality can be obtained. The invention of the Walkman tape recorder has revolutionized many things, but it is probably a defining moment in the study of the modern English language. Only in January this year, as part of the CAN-Code project, my department bought a single microphone costing £1,700. It's the size of my shirt button. It has a direction finder in my pocket. It was developed by the CIA in the 1980s, manufactured by Sony in the 1990s. An interesting bit of cultural history there. But I can hear what people are saying at the back of the room. In fact, those two of you have just said this lesson very long, isn't it? I've just been recorded into my pocket. The key point is that the microphone needs to be small enough to be unobtrusive, because we all talk differently when we know that we're being recorded. In fact, when we know that we're being recorded, we ratchet up our discourse to greater levels of formality. We approximate the written much more. In case some of you should be concerned, I'll also point out that we do get permission from people to use the data. Sometimes we are ethical, but sometimes it's a kind of retrospective ethics. We ask them after we've recorded the data. But we often do need to anonymise the data. 60% of our discourse is about people who are not present at the time the conversation is taking place. Approximately 60%. And much of it is not complimentary. So names and places and so on have to be anonymised. I'll move on to curricular questions, how you position all of this in the context of an undergraduate English degree. But let me first of all look just a little bit further at a wider range of examples, internationalise a little bit, but retain a focus on our central pattern-forming and pattern-reforming structures. I'd like to look at a speech by Tony Blair, some exchanges of a mixed-race adolescent group in Leicester, and 2 Hong Kong Chinese emailers. While we do these things, don't forget to keep asking the question about the men from Glasgow. The men from Glasgow went for men to go would have been impossible. Is that an English sentence? Would anybody say it? While I'm putting up the handout, just have a look at the speech, the extract from the closing sequence of Tony Blair's speech to the Labour Party conference in Brighton in 1997. Tony Blair has learned how to pattern form. All his speechwriters know the power of pattern forming. Our policies and attitudes have changed, but there are no old Labour or new Labour values. They are what make us the party of compassion, of social justice, of the struggle against poverty, of liberty, of basic human solidarity. And the day we cease to be those things is the day we keep the name of the Labour Party but lose the reason for its existence. On May 1st, 1997, it wasn't just the Tories who were defeated, cynicism was defeated. Fear of change was defeated. Did I not say that it would be a battle of hope against fear? On May 1st, 1997, fear lost, hope won. The giving age began. Now make the good that is in the heart of each of us serve the good of all. Britain, head and heart, can be unbeatable. That is the Britain I offer you. That is the Britain that together can be ours. I think this is another example of little duckling, my son. In close analysis, I do actually think as part of an English degree, close analysis of this type of thing is very, very important. And we're very good at doing it. As Kate was saying yesterday, close reading is what we do very, very well. We can spend all morning looking at this particular speech. It's got all sorts of fascinating linguistic structures built into it. And he talks about the war in Iraq in pretty much the same kind of terms, in pattern-forming terms. It's a discourse remarkably similar to that of Ronald Reagan. They've learned it from Ronald Reagan. It's very, very similar in linguistic structure. It has little content. I find it difficult to work out what he's saying, if anything at all. But maybe that's part of the art of the linguistically skillful politician. Or maybe it's because he uses pattern forming because his main purpose is perhaps not to draw attention to or otherwise make salient the content of his message, but rather to focus on the creation of an interpersonal relationship. In a manner not dissimilar to the relationship building of those art students in the Sunday afternoon example. Very much a discourse of reciprocity, backed up visually, because if you notice how camera angles work with with Tony Blair. There's always a symmetry between the camera and Tony Blair's eye. His advisors work very, very closely on that. It has to be symmetrical. It can't be asymmetrical. Poor old Ian Duncan-Smith hasn't really learned this yet. He's either camera angle like that or camera angle like that. He doesn't use pronouns anywhere near as successfully as Tony Blair does. This is a discourse of reciprocity. It gets people not noticing what's being said. Instead, it gets you to notice how he's saying it, how well he's saying it, how much he's with you while saying it. It's very artful. It's very skillful. It involves pattern forming rather than pattern reforming. That perhaps we always knew that Tony Blair was a pattern former rather than a pattern reformer. So far, an impression has probably been created that there is a kind of monolingual purity to these practices, that creativity and language play in our corpus reside within a single language. This is not the case. Bilingual and multilingual communities are especially rich in the production of oral artifacts of various kinds. Research in what for me is one of the most important sociolinguistic studies in the 1990s by a sociolinguist at King's College London called Ben Rampton, a book called Crossing, describes a phenomenon, a feature of cross-lingual play and of creativity with language codes which is distinctively oral rather than written in mode. The specific focus of language crossing in Rampton's studies is centred on multiracial urban adolescence in the South Midlands of Britain. It concerns, to quote, the use of Creole by adolescents of Asian and Anglo descent, the use of Punjabi by Anglos and Afro-Caribbeans, and the use of stylized Indian English by all three. Rampton's data goes a long way to illustrate the degree to which members of the group's study engaged in crossing from one language to another as part of day-to-day demotic spoken exchanges. Typical examples of the data include contexts in which a 15-year-old boy, an Afro-Caribbean boy, teases a classmate, a 15-year-old Asian girl, about her having an older boyfriend by using a stylized Asian English with marked Punjabi intonation in order to tease and to encourage her to engage in playful banter. Most instances found by Rampton, however, involve the use of Creole, which has much more social significance in the discourse, and of crossings into Creole. In Rampton's data, Creole is much more extensively integrated by all speakers, indicating the extent to which it is symbolic of all that is valued in the culture shared by the adolescents in the study. In the following example, and I keep losing my position here, but it's example 9 on the handout. And I put it up because it's quite hard to keep reading these rather small print on a handout. In the example, two boys, one Anglo, Alan, and one Asian, Asif, both aged 15, are being held in detention. The extract here shows them speaking with an Anglo female teacher, Miss J, aged in her mid-20s. She says why she is a little late for the supervision of the detention that they're on, and explains that she had to contact the head teacher, and then why she now needs to go to fetch her lunch before the detention proper begins. The boys attempt to undermine and criticise her position by locking her into a sequence of question and answer. When she departs and the boys are left on their own, they mock her statements using a markedly Creole intonation, most saliently marked in the consonantal pattern formed on the word lunch. I have to go and see the headmaster. Why? None of your business. About us. No, I'll be back. Hey, how can you see the headmaster when he was in dinner? That's precisely why I didn't see him. What? I'll be back in a second with my lunch. No, that's sad man. I have to dismiss my plate. Right, I've got to go. With mine. Lunch? You don't need no lunch. Have you eat your lunch, Alan? These linguistic mixes indicate an underlying creative skill in the appropriate handling of two voices, what Bakhtin called double voicing. The resulting hybrid discourse is not simply created for its own sake. In many of Rampton's examples, the double voicing is put to social use, either for purposes of criticism, for verbal dueling, which reinforces group values and affiliations, or to express identities and values which are separate from the dominant discourses and which could not be altogether articulated within the domain of a single voice or dialect or accent. As we've seen, creativity in common speech is mainly convergent, but it is not simply convergent. Here it is deliberately divergent, seeking to exclude or to adopt an adversarial stance to others. Pattern forming can be hostile. If you don't believe me, try repeating word for word what someone says to you over a long stretch of discourse and watch their reaction. The important thing here, though, is a question of value which is raised, because the most prized members of the community studied by Rampton are those who can achieve the most skillful verbal crossings, and the really prized are those who can achieve the most skillful verbal crossings into Creole, whatever their ethnic background. The significance of the relationship between creative communication, language crossing, and more intimate speech genres is evident in another corpus we have, this time a corpus of internet relay chat, collected as a supplement to the Canco corpus. We have several thousand emails, several hours of internet relay chat data on a variety of topics. One of the things we're looking at, of course, for the Cambridge Grammar of English that we're constructing is the way in which email is a discourse which embeds spoken forms within written text, essentially. In that sense, it's a very interesting hybrid form. But in the following example, and that is example, well, it's the next example on the handout. Two of our students have been captured, if that's the word, emailing to each other using a kind of discourse not too far removed from Finnegan's Wake, but which involves transliterated Cantonese, text messaging shorthand, and English, in order to mark out what I think to be a unique interpersonal territory in which English remains, nonetheless, the core substratum of what they do. Vicky writes, "It's snowing quite strong outside, be careful." "I will, thanks." "Wei wei li dim ah." "Okay la, just got back from Amsterdam lo. How are you?" "Okay la, I have 9 tomorrow." That's, I have a 9 o'clock lecture tomorrow. "Ha ha ha, I have 2 to 4. So happy." "Che, anyway, have your rush gone?" "Yes, but I have scar." Oh, ugly, ah." I see. Gang you la. Still a pretty girl, haha. If you want to see the Cantonese translations, they're printed on the next page. I showed these emails recently to the education editor of the Daily Telegraph, and they said they made him want to cut his throat. Some may argue, indeed I think the education editor of the Daily Telegraph would, that such a discourse underlines the irreversible decline of standard English into a mutually unintelligible sub-language set. But another way of seeing such exchanges is to observe the richness and invention of which everyday users of English are capable, and to praise the creative invention which results from the mixing. An even stronger interpretation would be to recognize the clear need the two girls have to appropriate a language which is not simply English, but their own English, and for them to develop a repertoire of mixed codes which enables them to give expression to feelings of friendship, intimacy, and involvement with each other's attitudes and feelings. A discourse which would not be to the same degree available to them through the medium of standard English. Here, there is no overt expression of social critique, as in the crossing example into Creole made by the adolescent speakers captured by Rampton. But there is nonetheless an implicit recognition that standard English has no clear value for them, at least for the purposes of daily, intimate email exchange. and accordingly, new modes of speaking and writing are developed. Why might a study of naturally occurring spoken English form one component in modern English language programs in an English undergraduate degree course? Why would we study this within an English language and literature degree program? What is its relevance to English studies in the context of teaching and studying English internationally? Analysis of language has, within most of our departments, tended to be seen almost exclusively in terms of distinctions between literary and non-literary. The literary, and this has quotation marks around it, has often been privileged and without over much attention to what might be meant by literary or literariness in language seen almost exclusively as autonomous. Study of large quantities of spoken English of the kind that I've tried to illustrate this morning empowers us to question such parameters and begin to explore the extent to which the literary and the non-literary, common speech and uncommon discourses operate along lines and continua, and that there are points of connection along such lines. Courses can in part, of course, explore the constructive and affective nature of creativity in speech, and compare it with post-romantic constructs of creativity at the preserve of the isolated, individual, paradigm-shifting artist. They can be set alongside the changing history of words such as genius, original, art, creative, literature, and common from the 18th century onwards, or earlier, as exemplified by Raymond Williams and others. And students begin to work out how differently performative language is in different contexts. I am not advocating that reading George Eliot is the same as reading conversational transcripts. But I am saying that there are continuities between the practices, and I am advocating a better understanding of the way in which language works in these practices. Better understanding the character and patterns of everyday language can support attempts to establish stronger bridges between language and literature teaching. Appreciation of literary and cultural variation can be linked with what is common, with what students already understand, with what students can already do, rather than by means of more deficit-related pedagogies. The idea that creativity exists in a remote and difficult-to-access world of literary genius can be demotivating to the apprentice student of literature, especially in contexts, and this is important internationally, where second language English literature is taught, and where a primary goal still remains mastery of that second language. Or even in the context of English within an agenda of widening participation, where students will come to us from very different backgrounds of reading and with very different cultures of reading. Again, I hope I'm not being so naive as to say that we might recuperate the literary from the study of everyday discourses. Of course not. But it is a common shared source of insight and offers particularly rich potential for pedagogic involvement. Such courses can also help students gain access to new technologies, something which I believe to be important in overcoming naive art sciences divides. I wouldn't be saying this 2 years ago, but Corpus Linguistics is now highly user-friendly. Searches in multi-million word corpora can be made with a click of the mouse. Corpora can be bought for the same price as a standard dictionary or grammar. The British National Corpus Sampler Disc, containing 1 million words of written English and 1 million words of spoken English, costs £35. Learning to transcribe spoken language, especially spoken prosodies, underlines the complexity of the relationship between the spoken and the written, and exposes and actualizes, in the sense of actually making actual for the student, key theoretical questions about the relative primacy of the spoken language, raised by Bakhtin, deconstructed by Derrida, for whom, as we know, speech was not primary, and indeed for anyone evaluating their own processes of discourse. The value of studying such ethnographies of speaking also enables us to look at different speech communities and cultures, and to begin to explore in what cultural contexts wordplay and spoken creativities are possible and why. For example, the kind of language play we've been looking at and examining here this morning is not normally prevalent in more formal, socially asymmetrical contexts, such as being stopped for speeding on the motorway, in legal cross-examination, or in university job interviews. So the more asymmetrical the social context, the more power is distributed to one speaker rather than another, the less stimulus there is to creative wordplay across speaking turns, the less stimulus there is to creative pattern forming and reforming. Basing our study on written text is thus only part of the story of English. Engaging with spoken discourses also forces upon us more contextually appropriate theories of value, especially aesthetic and social values. At some point, we cannot escape evaluation of the relative functions of a pun in Shakespeare and the pun on the word mobile in the art student's dialogue. At the same time, such questions of value and evaluation force upon us just what it is we mean by a text, and why different discourse communities value certain different uses of language. In other words, what is valued in language use varies from one discourse community to another, something which I think Isabel Armstrong is saying in her book The Radical Aesthetic, which I find very influential. Looking closely at and listening to large quantities of spoken data helps us to understand language change. I mean, one of the things that's happening around us, you must be aware of this, is an increasing democratization and conversationalization of discourse. Language is becoming more and more informal. What does that tell us about the emergence of different cultural relations as a result? Is it driven by social change, or is language change independent of different social and cultural formations? On one level, it is a matter of airlines being called Go, or Buzz, or Be My Baby, or laundrettes being called soap opera. On one level, it is that. On another level, it's to do with the way in which society changes, and those changes are impregnated within particular spoken formations. The relationship between language and gender can be investigated. For example, in our data, it seems that female speakers sometimes use creatively marked language as a means to break into male-dominated talk. Pattern forming is much more common in female talk than in male talk. Men prefer rehearsed joke-telling and often rather stagey sexual puns. In fact, when compared with women, men are not that spontaneously creative at all in talk. And women do very successfully manage sexual banter, but often only in female-female company. The Nottingham Campco Corpus team is also currently examining how non-literal hyperbolic speech acts, like the Daily Telegraph editor saying, "Why don't I just cut my throat?" how those speech acts are used for humorous effect, and how they're distributed according to different social and gender roles. Modern Scottish literature is also a particularly rich source of inventiveness in the use of demotic speech. Examples abound, but my reading of the fiction of James Kelman, Irving Welsh, Janice Galloway, A.L. Kennedy, the poetry of Robert Crawford, Tom Leonard, Jackie Kay, underlines that much can be learned here for a fuller definition of what we've been discussing here this morning, not least in the socio-political import of writing, which contests and displaces the standard metropolitan versions of British English. So much of the writing runs in parallel to devolution. There is, as it were, a kind of linguistically devolved English. Look at the extract from Irving Welsh on the handout. An uncommonly striking discourse deeply rooted in demotic speech patterns. And international literatures are, of course, doing similar things in kicking against standard international British English and American English. Indian, Singapore, Nigerian, Kenyan, Caribbean, Filipino literatures in English are all not unlike the Cantonese students in their Hotmail email exchanges, mixing and subverting the common and the uncommon, pattern forming and pattern reforming, destabilizing and restabilizing, and in the process drawing fundamentally on, while at the same time questioning notions of standard and non-standard, making the English language their own. And remember that, again, that in terms of our canonical grammars and dictionaries, most standard forms are still by omission, most spoken forms are still by omission non-standard. If we now, finally, return to our sentence in the box on the handout, what can we say about it? The men from Glasgow went for men to go would have been impossible. linguist that says the women from Glasgow went for women to go would have been impossible. That's by the way. I would argue that it's difficult to see a central place for such study of the English language in an English department. The sentence is made up. It is not real data. The analytical linguist sits in an armchair and introspects and encourages students to do the same on data that no one would ever produce. The data is sentence-based, written, idealized, decontextualized. It may be a text by some definition, but it lacks texture. It is monologic rather than dialogic. It is emotionless. It is primarily referential and ideational in content. It is completely out of key with the way English language is studied at A-level. Hence the disappointments of many undergraduate students who follow courses in linguistics departments, driven there perhaps because so few English departments cater for their interests. I would want to encourage the study of naturally occurring spoken and written language in its social and cultural formation. I think language study should embrace aesthetic questions, social questions, cultural questions. It should be integrated with the study of literature, however this is theorized or conceived. It should be alert to cross-cultural and cultural factors, alert to the place of English as a main language of world communication. It should explore language use along continua from common to uncommon, questioning all the time, as Raymond Williams would, just what we mean by common. It should at times look at English which everybody uses in their daily lives. It should look at language play and creativity, at language uses as daily cultural practices. I think language should be studied analytically, but also ethnographically, as empirical data, while questioning at the same time what we mean by empirical, of course. I think students themselves should be directly involved in collecting this data themselves, using both quantitative and qualitative research methodologies, questioning in the process just what we mean by a fact or a linguistic fact. The condition of the subject, English language, is healthy at A-level, very healthy at postgraduate levels, but there is a much greater conditionality about it at undergraduate levels. Respecting the ordinary language of ordinary people is not an act of trendy academicism, but recognition of the fact that those ordinary people increasingly use their ordinary voices to act in an extraordinary global village, especially as the common voice gets more democratized and as ever more new Englishes emerge.